So in this video, we're going to discuss your venous negative pressure and all the parameters that can happen that would affect your negative pressures. The first most important thing I have to mention regarding your negative pressure on your venous is that it is directly related to your flows. So if your negative pressure becomes too negative, it will directly affect your flows. If you have set your negative pressure parameters, your low priority and high priority, you should be notified before it actually affects your flows. If it does not give you an alarm and your flows are affected, that means your ranges you've set for your negative pressure are too far off or they're too negative. But if they do go off too early, but you still have the same flows, it has not affected, maybe you have set your negative pressure parameters a little too tight. So let's go over a scenario as what would happen and what you would do. We have a patient right here starting with a baseline of -30, but this patient starts becoming more negative. Your flows are affected here. I'm going to silence this so you're not hearing the alarm. It is affecting your flows, but you don't get any low priority or high priority alarms on your negative pressure. What is going on in this scenario? Every time it affects your flows, that means that your negative pressure values probably were not set correctly. On this case, they had set them way too negative. So at these levels, you will definitely have very, very low flows before you actually see the high and low priority alarms. That's why it is very important for you guys to set those values correctly. So let's go ahead and discuss what can affect your negative pressures on your venous side in this video. So remember, your negative pressure is directly related to your patient and your cannula inside the patient. There is a few scenarios where your negative pressures can go very negative. You could have a kink in your venous line. You could have positional issues on your cannula inside the patient. That's very difficult to see. You could also have issues with hypovolemia. So how can you distinguish all of these events that can happen? How can you tell what is causing it and what is not? The rule of thumb is usually if an event is happening too quickly, then it probably is not volume unless the patient is really bleeding out heavily. I have had 1 or 2 cases where the patient was bleeding very heavily and we could not replace the fluid, and my changes in my negative pressures happened a lot faster than I expected. But usually hypovolemia is a gradual event. So if you see a gradual increase in your parameters, then you would know that this patient needs volume. The other 2 issues that can cause your negative pressures to be negative is the position of the cannula inside the body. This usually you will know before when you initiate a patient on ECMO and the negative pressures are a little too negative. Let's say they do subclavian cannulations, or they do IJ cannulations on the opposite side of the patient where the cannula has to curve to go where it needs to go. All of these cases can create very high negative pressures. But remember, in these cases, the patient will start with a high negative pressure baseline. So giving volume or trying to play with that cannula is not going to help the situation. You just have to live with high negative pressures or flow less. For Avalon cannulas, that can cause high negative pressures. If the cannula position shifts a little bit or if it's sitting right next to a tissue, then yes, definitely the position can affect your flows. And sometimes that is always in when most of the cases is very immediate. So you will know, let's say you're changing the dressing for the patient, and as soon as you kind of lift the patient, you see your negative pressures go very negative and your flows drop. This is an indication maybe it is positional because you were just moving the patient and that's when it happened. In those cases, try to put them back to the position they were comfortable in. Try to shake the bed a little bit to get that cannula position okay. One recommendation would be to drop your flows down a little bit to release that suction on the tip of that cannula, and that can help you. So drop your RPMs down and then slowly go up, and that's another recommendation. If you have a kink in your line, can happen in the same situation. You could have a patient where you're changing their bedding and you're shifting them, and then when you put them back on to the bed, their cannulas kink. So every time you have a sudden shift in your negative pressures, check your lines, number 1, to make sure there's no kink on it. Assess if you have just changed the bedding or you have changed the position of the patient and put them back to where they were. If the negative pressure baseline was high already on this patient, I would just leave it be because you know this patient's baseline was already negative.